It's time for us to check back in with Watermelon Hill and see what happens next. If you've missed any of the previous readings, just look in the description below for a playlist. And if you'd like to pick up your own copy of this wonderful, wonderful book, visit watermelonhillbook.com, and I'll put that link in the description below too. Spooks and Haints. I think most older brothers and sisters tell ghost stories to the little kids to try to put a scare into them. I had 2 older sisters and 3 older brothers, so I heard my fair share. I was a little scared sometimes, but I would never give them the satisfaction of letting them know it. I think the scariest stories by far were the ones that were told for true about our own family. Some of these stories were probably believed by some members of the family because they were superstitious, but other stories just seemed to have no rational explanation at all. This one technically is not a ghost story, but actually happened at our farm long before we moved there. There was a log house there then. According to the stories, a teenage girl in the family got pregnant. That would have been the cause of great shame in a family at that time, probably around the turn of the century. Someone in the family, reputedly her brother, beat her. The next day, the girl stayed home by herself and cooked dinner while the rest of the family went to work in the fields. She completed the dinner and put it on the table, then seeing no way out of her shameful situation, she got a shotgun, went out in the yard, and blew her brains out. She was buried in the graveyard on the farm. We never saw any ghosts, but it was still a little spooky knowing someone had once killed herself in what was now our yard. I sometimes thought about it when walking by the graveyard. This graveyard was on our farm, but did not belong to us, so we had to allow access to it. There were even a few people buried here after we bought the farm. It was located not more than 100 yards from the road leading up to our house. On the other side of the road, at about the same distance and up on a little hill on the Shannon's land, was another graveyard. The road to our house wound up a hill, was overhung with trees, and dark as a dungeon at night. Even though I was not superstitious, sometimes when I would be walking up our road at night after riding the bus home from a football game or something, it was impossible to keep from thinking about the fact that the graveyards were there. This is not a ghost story either, but still spooky to a little kid on a dark night, when the only light was from a coal oil lamp or a flickering fireplace. One of Mom's sisters, my Aunt Stella, died from diphtheria when she was only 32 years old. When she was declared dead, as per the custom of the day in the country, she was put on display in her coffin in the parlor at home. There was no embalming in that day and in that part of the country, so the funeral was usually within 2 days for obvious reasons, especially if it was warm weather. Dad and Mom both said Aunt Stella did not look like a dead person, but still retained much of her color. There was no visible breathing or any other evidence of life, but she just didn't look dead. It was customary for friends and relatives to sit up with the dead person at night until the funeral. That first night, my dad and a couple of other family members were sitting up talking when they heard a sound from the direction of the coffin. Dad always swore that it was an exhale of breath, like a sigh. This shook them up a little, but they went to the coffin to look, and Dad swore that they could see color fading from her cheeks as they watched. I think it was a true case of near premature burial. They did not have any sophisticated means of determining death, so if there was no breathing, they pronounced her dead. Dad told a story that happened when he was young, before he met Mom. He and another boy were walking 2 girls home one night when just as they were passing a graveyard, there was a horrible scream. They were all scared, but the girls absolutely panicked and tried to run away. Dad said he and the other boy had to hold on to the girls and walk them away from the graveyard until they finally calmed down a little. Dad said he was afraid if they got away, they would have run themselves to death. I'm sure it was just the scream of a wildcat, but the coincidence of it happening just as they were passing a graveyard was pretty scary. These are a couple of stories that Mom and Dad told many times that happened in Johnson County, Kentucky, where my sister Edna and my brother Jack were born. The roof leaked in several places, so Mom had various glass jars, tin cans, pans, etc. set about in the attic to catch the drips when it rained. One night, everyone was asleep when there was a terrible racket in the attic, like something was knocking over all the containers up there. They assumed it was rats, though the noise was a bit extreme for rats, and went back to sleep. In a day or two, Mom thought about what had happened and decided to set the containers back up before it rained again. She climbed up into the attic and was shocked to find every single container setting upright and exactly where she had left them. All members of the family denied having anything to do with it, or even having been in the attic at all. One day, while they lived in the same house, Dad was helping some neighbors dig a grave, always a good start for a spooky story, and went off in the morning with his tools on his shoulder. Mom expected Dad home for dinner and was not surprised to hear the clatter on the porch of Dad dropping his tools when it was near dinner time. She proceeded to put the food on the table, thinking Dad was home. She assumed he would be in shortly, but she waited, and still he did not come in. She went outside looking for him and saw him just coming over the hill in the distance, carrying his tools. He had not been home, and there were no tools or dirt from tools or anything else on the porch. All the kids were off somewhere too, and there was no sign of what could have made the noise. Mom said the noise was exactly like someone had dropped tools on the porch. Dropping a shovel, mattock, and pick on a wooden porch makes a distinctive and very loud noise, and there was no explanation available. I don't know the cause of the two previous happenings, but it may be significant that they both happened in the same house. Just perhaps it may really have been a spirit of some sort floating around in it. My Uncle George Caudill, Dad's brother, lived in a rented house in Ohio where strange things happened, but not in any other house where he lived. In the kitchen there was a door to the cellar which would not stay shut. It had a latch. You had to lift and drop down in place to latch the door so it wouldn't come open just from a draft or not being balanced right on the hinges, but it still came open. Not every night, but often enough to draw attention to it and shake them up. One night, Uncle George and Aunt Lorraine were in bed asleep when they both woke up and both heard a noise. They described it as the sound a cannon lid would make if it rolled across a wooden floor. I'm talking about the outer rim of a two-piece lid that goes on a glass cannon jar. They make a unique ringing sound. They said it sounded like it was rolling down the hall, then came into their room and rolled around for a while before going back out the door and back down the hall. Aunt Lorraine said, "George, go see what that was." Uncle George said, "If you want to know so bad, you go see what it was." I might have chalked this up to one of Uncle George's tall tales if Aunt Lorraine hadn't substantiated it, but she did, so who knows? My Grandpa Thompson told a story that supposedly happened to him when he was a young man. He said that he had been out one night and was returning home very late. He was riding his horse, which was the normal mode of transportation in the hills of West Virginia in those days and for a long time afterward. He said it was a moonlit night and he was just riding along when he looked off to the side and saw a little girl in a long flowing dress sitting in the top of a tree. Naturally, he was startled. It's not often you see a little girl sitting in the top of a tree in the middle of the night, but before he had time to think about it, she came floating through the air and landed on the back of his horse. Grandpa said that he was scared speechless. His horse seemed to be frozen as well and would not go faster than a walk. He continued on in mute terror until suddenly the little girl just disappeared and he was able to move again. Grandpa said he almost ran his horse to death before he got home. I don't know, but I've got a pretty good guess about the cause of this story. Grandpa was not a drunk by any means, and I never saw him take a drink, but the older folks all say that in his younger days he was known to take a drink, or 3, or 4, occasionally. A few drinks and a generous helping of superstition can have a lot of influence in the middle of the night. Some of that moonshine was pretty potent. There were lots of other stories, but the scariest to me by far was Uncle Walter's story about the little hand with 3 icy cold fingers. Uncle Walter was still living at home with Grandma and Grandpa Thompson at the time. He was planning to go hunting the next day and was sound asleep, as he was going to get up very early the next morning. He went to sleep with his arm hanging over the side of the bed and said he woke up suddenly and felt the grip of a little hand on his arm. He said it was like a child's hand, but held him firmly. The hand had 3 little fingers, and they were icy cold. He was frozen. He could not speak or move. Finally, the little hand let go, and he screamed loud enough to wake up the whole family. Naturally, there was no sign of the thing with the 3 cold little fingers. They were all a little superstitious and took this as an omen that he should not go hunting, as he might have an accident. They took things like that seriously, so Uncle Walter stayed home the next day. A strange coincidence was that Grandma said she had been woken up earlier by a noise that she thought was an uncle who was staying with them coming into the house. There was no evidence that anyone or anything had come in. I would not have admitted to anyone that I was scared by this or any other story, but I was. For years afterward, I would be drifting off to sleep when I would realize that my arm was hanging over the edge of the bed. I would tell myself that I knew it was just a silly story, probably just a nightmare my uncle had, and I was not going to give in and move my hand. I was not. I would lay there getting more and more tense, with sweat starting to pop out on me. Finally, I would shamefully pull my hand back up and then go to sleep. I would not have told this to a soul back then, but at my age now, who cares? And no, it doesn't still bother me now. Honest. Almost never. Mom's Kitchen. I know Mom's Kitchen holds pleasant memories for all of the family and most anyone else who ever visited with us. No one ever came that Mom didn't fix something to eat for them, even if it was 2 in the morning. She would be setting out leftovers and sandwich fixings, making coffee, and trying to force everyone to eat, whether they were hungry or not. Let me take you on a quick tour of Mom's kitchen as it looked in the later years. As you enter from the living bedroom, the safe where most of the dishes are stored is on the left in the corner. Then in front of the window, the rinse tubs for laundry. Then the refrigerator. In the back left corner are some built-in shelves where the pots and pans are stored, and to the right is a trash can made from a small wooden barrel. Going back to the starting point on the right is the wringer washing machine, then the buffet in the right corner where tablecloths, sheets, and other linens are stored. Next, believe it or not, is a clothes dryer, though Mom still hung the clothes outside if the weather was nice. Further down the right wall is the kitchen cabinet with all Mom's spices, flour, meal, and most of her baking equipment. Just past the kitchen cabinet is the back door opening out onto a porch. In the back right corner is a small table which holds 2 buckets of water from the well to be used for drinking or cooking. Also on the table are 2 small enamel wash basins where we wash up before meals. At the back left corner of this table is a dish with soap and a small can of coal oil to help start fires in the stove. In the middle of the back wall is Mom's stove with the wood box behind it next to the wall. That completes the kitchen except for the table in the middle of the room. It is a large table, handmade by Grandpa Thompson out of plain lumber, but always covered with a tablecloth. Usually the cover is a patterned oilcloth for ease of cleanups, except on special occasions when it is covered with a white linen tablecloth. On the left side of the table, just in front of the refrigerator, is a long bench. There are chairs on the right side and the end away from the stove. There is no chair on the end next to the stove, too hot there, unless we have a lot of company. Whenever any of us went home, we could have gone into Mom's kitchen in the dark and found any particular dish or pan we wanted with no problem at all. Mom did not have a lot of cabinets, so she was strictly organized and would not allow us to put away a dish or pan out of place. Counter space was non-existent, so the table had to double as her workspace. Here, cakes were mixed by hand, pie crusts and cookies rolled out and cut, and most of the food preparation done. It was amazing what she could do, having so little to work with. I don't guess our breakfast, or for that matter most of our other meals, were healthy as far as fat content or cholesterol were concerned, but they sure were good. We hardly ever had cereal or any other quick and easy breakfast, but always a full meal. We would wake up to the sounds and smells of breakfast cooking, wonderful smells of coffee brewing, bacon or sausage frying, and biscuits baking. Dad always insisted on homemade biscuits, and Mom made them every morning, and cornbread every evening for supper. Finally, after the last of the children, me, left home, Mom gradually weaned Dad off the homemade biscuits and went to canned ones. The remainder of Dad's breakfast stayed the same for the rest of his days. He always had eggs with bacon or sausage, gravy, coffee, which he cooled in his saucer, and biscuits of some type with some sweetener. Usually he would mix either honey or sorghum molasses with butter and spread it on his biscuits. The butter, if at all possible, was homemade, but this became increasingly hard to find in the neighborhood as the years went by. There just simply were not many people making it anymore, so Dad would sometimes drive 30 or 40 miles to get it. This was our usual breakfast and was good, but I enjoyed a change from the usual fare. One of my favorites was fried sweet potatoes with gravy. Delicious. Also fried apples with gravy. I'm salivating right now. The gravy was usually made from leftover bacon grease, which Mom always saved. On rare occasions, as a treat, Mom fixed thickened blackberries served over biscuits. They were almost like pie filling and were scrumptious. Sometimes we had oatmeal, but even managed to make that heart-healthy food unhealthy but delicious. Sometimes we added raisins, which were healthy, but also added generous helpings of sugar and butter, which were not. My favorite oatmeal was with bacon or sausage crumbled into it along with sugar and butter. Even when we had these different things which were treats to us, Dad still almost always stuck with his usual, which meant Mom had to basically cook 2 breakfasts instead of 1. During the early years when there was a lot of farm work going on, Mom cooked a full meal for lunch, or as we called the midday meal, dinner. When it was ready, she would ring the dinner bell to call everyone in from the fields. That bell could be heard for a mile or 2 easily. In later years, after we didn't do much farm work anymore, dinner was a simpler affair. Supper was the evening meal. It was good, but usually wasn't anything elaborate, usually leftovers from dinner, sometimes just vegetables and of course cornbread. Our main meat was cured pork, but it had to be used up by spring as it wasn't safe to try to keep it during the summer with no refrigeration. After it was used up, our meat was canned sausage and occasional chicken or wild meat. The staple po' folks meal, but also one of our favorites, was soup beans, cornbread, and onions. That's all except something to drink. The beans might have been Great Northerns, Navies, or Pintos, but they were all soup beans to us. We made a meal out of them quite often, and my favorite drink with soup beans and cornbread was buttermilk. I still have this meal once in a while and still enjoy it. As a snack, I would sometimes have a bowl of cold cornbread, buttermilk, and onions. To this day, soup beans and cornbread are on the menu at Dee's Dairy Queen in Louisa. We always had plenty of vegetables from the garden. They were wonderful all year round, but at their best when they were fresh from the garden. Along with all the normal vegetables, we had things like fried green tomatoes, just like the movie title. They may be an acquired taste as they are slightly tangy. We also sliced cucumbers lengthwise and fried them just like the tomatoes. They have a milder taste. We even fried polk, a wild plant. Remember the Tom Jones song, Polk Salad Annie? The berries and the roots are poisonous, but we just used the young tender shoots after we peeled them. All these things were rolled in flour or meal and fried in bacon grease. When we had fresh vegetables in the garden, we had salads with lettuce, radishes, carrots, etc., but sometimes even that became unhealthy. Occasionally we would have what we called killed lettuce. It may sound terrible, but I loved it. Mom would heat bacon grease with some vinegar, salt and pepper in a skillet, then drizzle it over a bowl of lettuce. This wilts the lettuce, thus the name killed. Sometimes we would crumble some crispy bacon into it. It has been many, many years since I have tasted that. On an ordinary day, Mom's kitchen was a haven of great smells and taste, but my favorite time there was Bacon Day. Mom was a great cook, and her culinary delights were all the more impressive considering what she had to work with. The stove burned wood for heat, so she would just slide a pot to the other end of the stove from the firebox to reduce the heat. The oven was harder to regulate. The only way to regulate the heat was to add more wood or to let it cool down. This was further complicated because the oven door spring was broken and had been for as far back as I can remember, so it would not stay closed on its own. The solution was a stick of wood about 2.5 feet long with a piece of tin fastened around the end which contacted the stove, and the other end secured by a wooden cleat nailed to the floor about 8 inches from the front of the stove, just like putting a chair under a doorknob. To open the door, the stick was removed and the door was open. Mom always told a story on me concerning the stove. I was probably 3 or 4 at the time. The kitchen floor sloped downhill toward the back door and was a little shaky, so when Mom was baking a cake, everyone had to be very careful not to shake the floor or the cake would fall. As Mom said, flat as a flitter. I never did know just what a flitter was, but I assumed it was some kind of pancake since it was the very definition of flat. Anyway, she said that I started to come into the kitchen when she saw me and said, "Delbert," I always hated that name, "be careful and don't shake the floor. I've got a cake in the oven." She said I tiptoed into the kitchen, being very careful and not making a sound until I got right in front of the stove, then jumped up and down as hard as I could. What a brat! The cake fell and my bottom got a much-deserved warming. For the life of me, I don't know why I would have done anything to damage one of Mom's cakes as much as I loved them. Despite all the daunting obstacles, Mom made luscious desserts of all kinds: cakes, gingerbread, pies, cobblers, cookies, candies, puddings, homemade whipped cream, and even 2 or 3 kinds of cheeses. We didn't have all these goodies on a regular basis, but most of the time there was at least one of them prepared. In the summer, my favorite cake was Mom's 3-layer strawberry shortcake. We didn't have a cultivated strawberry patch, but there must have been a couple of them in the past that had gone wild, and I was always more than willing to pick enough for the cake as well as eating my fill while doing it. I guess my other favorite cake was her 3-layer cake with each layer of a different flavor. One was normal yellow cake with vanilla flavoring, one was chocolate, and the other was colored red and flavored with cinnamon, all covered with a poured-on frosting which hardened to almost a candy consistency. Wonderful. On Thanksgiving and Christmas, though, Mom really outdid herself with a great selection of mouth-watering delights. In addition to various cakes, there was a variety of pies depending on what berries or fruits she had canned, as well as lemon, chocolate, or vanilla pudding pies, with, of course, homemade pie crusts. All of them yummy. My favorite cookies were ginger snaps, soft molasses, and sugar. Favorite candies were chocolate and peanut butter fudge. Mom made more varieties of cookies and candies than I can remember, but these were my favorites. Of course, I can't leave out banana pudding and peach and blackberry cobblers. There were so many favorites they encompassed about everything. I can't remember one single dessert I didn't love. As an adult, I've taken a bit of an interest in cooking myself, and once in a while I just have to make a banana pudding or peach cobbler to satisfy some old taste buds that haven't forgotten. One Thanksgiving recently, I revived some recipes from Mom's original cookbook and made her sugar cookies and soft molasses cookies. They were very well received by the guests. I won't say they were as good as Mom's, but they were very tasty and I got no complaints. Of course, I had to vary the original recipe by substituting Crisco for lard, but they were still good. Around the holidays or for a family reunion, I usually make some of Mom's chocolate fudge. All the family at the reunion love it. Sometimes it's just a short trip back to our childhood. Mixed with the aromas of Mom's bacon were the sounds of the stove door creaking as it opened or closed, and the sound of the roll-up door on her kitchen cabinet. The cabinet was passed down to me and is now proudly in use in my kitchen. As a matter of fact, most of Mom's kitchen is still in use by her children. My sister has the safe, and one of my brothers even has the stove in his kitchen, though it's not in use, just on display. Mom's kitchen definitely holds sweet and lasting memories for all of her children, grandchildren, other relatives, and friends. It is now gone, along with the rest of our old home, but we all remember it as if it were yesterday. And we'll stop right there. Makes me hungry hearing about Dale's mother and all the wonderful food that she fixed for her family. I really enjoyed hearing that and could just picture the kitchen the way he described it. But really does make me wish I could go back and sit down and eat some of her delicious cooking. And those desserts, that cake that was the 3 layers, that sounds so interesting. I've never heard of anything like that. If your family had some kind of recipe like that, please leave a comment and share it. Kind of makes me wonder if Dale's mother just invented it herself, because it sounds so unique but so delicious. He was talking about their meal that they had often of soup beans and cornbread. We had that last night, so that dish, that meal is still alive and well in my area of Appalachia, and I know in other places too. And we usually use pinto beans for soup beans, but like him, if we were having navies or Great Northerns, we'd still call them soup beans. We still would. And Dale mentioned he calls it killed lettuce. Sometimes I say, we just said kill lettuce. We didn't even put the ED, but also very common to hear it called kilt lettuce with that T. And wilted lettuce, just lettuce and onions. It goes by lots of different names, but we actually had that too. So we had that with our soup beans and cornbread. That's one of the things Matt and I look forward to most spring of the year, is to eat that first mess of killed lettuce with the fresh lettuce and the fresh green onions out of your garden. So good, such good eating. I liked that Dale's mother said flat as a flitter too. Granny says that. She said that my whole life. Well, that's flat as a flitter. So that's saying still alive too, and I know it was popular in other areas, but I love that Dale's mother said it and that Granny's still saying it today. Another similar thing between Granny and Dale's mother is that need to feed people. As soon as you come in, Granny's going to ask you if you want something to eat. She's going to offer to make you something. She's going to tell you what she's got for leftovers. She's going to offer you, she'll just keep trying, even if it's nothing but a cookie, to try to get you to eat something. And she does that to all of us. So that's another similar trait that Dale's mother and Granny had together. Cooking is so different today, you can't blame anyone that people are so busy. You can certainly see why so many people choose to eat out or just pick up something or pick up convenience foods, maybe prepackaged stuff that all they've got to do is warm up. I totally understand that because our lives are so busy. So a lot of people don't cook today, but there are still people that do, for sure. Matt and I hardly ever eat out. We pretty much cook everything here at home, and we're both fond of saying most of the time before we ate out or eat some kind of prepackaged thing or something, we would just as soon just have a sandwich, so we could just eat a peanut butter and jelly sandwich or a bologna sandwich, a banana sandwich, whatever it is. Of course, we do certainly love to go out to eat every once in a while. It's just not something we do all the time. But it's because of the nature of our modern day hurried lives, it is amazing the drastic difference between like Dale describing every inch of his mother's kitchen. He had such intimate knowledge of how her stove worked and where the dishes were kept and all that. And there's lots of people today that they don't even really, they may have a kitchen at home, but they don't necessarily have that knowledge that Dale had of his mother's kitchen, because they just don't use the kitchen. They just don't have time to cook. It's just easier and simpler to eat out or to pick up something on the way home or something like that. So drastic changes. Of course, there's lots of drastic changes. Even in describing the kitchen, he told about the water sitting on the table. Of course, today we just turn on the faucet and the water comes out. So there's lots of different changes, but I did think that was interesting, thinking about the difference in the way Dale's mother cooked and the way a lot of folks eat today. Then there was all those strange happenings. He's right. Kids love to tell ghost stories and then tell them to the younger ones and try to spook them and scare them, and that's just part of growing up. I've got tons of stories just like the ones he shared that have happened to either somebody in my family or someone's told me or something, and it is interesting to try to figure out what caused them. And sometimes you can, like the one he described of his with the little girl coming off the tree, that maybe that might have been some moonshine or some drinking involved. So sometimes you can kind of see something, but some of them just kind of seem to be unexplained, like the sound in the attic that his whole family, had heard it. It sounded like something knocking over all the pans, or the dumping of the tools on the porch, which turned out nothing was there in both cases. So sometimes there are things that are kind of unexplained, and it's kind of eerie and spooky to think about, and I guess we just will never know about some stuff. It is funny though, that's kind of a common human thing, whether you're in Appalachia or not, anywhere. Those occurrences happen that kind of give you the willies, give you the heebie-jeebies, we say, and get you spooked. And Dale's right. A graveyard's a good place to start thinking about spooky stuff, and before you know it, you've got yourself scared. Kind of talking about the change in the cookings, also change in the customs. So many things have changed since Dale's day, but even since my day. So in my lifetime, when he opens one of those spooky stories talking about the woman that had died early with diphtheria, his mother's sister, I believe it was, and that they had her, her funeral, her wake at home. So in my lifetime, Granny's sister and her brother was held at Granny Gazzy's house. They did that, had it at home. And people did stay up and stay there. I was not one of them, neither time. I believe Granny stayed both times, and I guess they just kind of set up and maybe took turns napping or something. But again, drastic change. And I'm not wanting to have a wake in my house like that. But there is something, so many of your feelings change as you get older. Dale kind of really, he said that about how he was scared to hang his hand over the bed, and used to he wouldn't admit that, but now who cares? Who cares if you know that he got spooked by that? So many things like that change as you get older. So like going through the death of Pap, my thought, I'd really never really thought about it, but going through that whole process with him, I did think about death more, the actual part of dying, not just what happens. We had the assurity of we believers, so we believe we know where we're going. I believe I know where Pap's at. I believe I'll see him again, all those kind of things. But just the actual aspect of death, we all have to face it. Miss Cindy's been telling me, and she's right, none of us are getting out of here alive, it's coming to all of us in one way or another. But I'd never really thought about it, but I know Pap had, especially in the last years of his life, he knew that it was coming quicker. One thing his age, but also his health. But it was really important for him. He wanted to die at home, and I just never give no thought to that, never even thought about it. And going through that with him made me realize, yeah, where else would you want to be but your home? He didn't want to be in a hospital with strange voices. Not that people in the hospital, nurses and doctors, they helped him get to the point where he was. They had nurtured him and help him heal him from his heart disease and all those kind of things until it just got to the point they couldn't. And he didn't want to do any more, to go through any more of that. But he really didn't want that. He didn't want to die in a hospital among strangers, even if they were nice strangers. He wanted to die at home. So in that same way, you can kind of see, like I said, I don't necessarily want to have a wake in my home, but, would you want to be in a funeral home, or would you want to be at home? It's just one of those things when you think about it. We've come so far since then, but it's one of those things I think, but have we come too far? Was that the better way? I don't know. Something to study on and think about for sure. Lots of changes from then till now, and even from my childhood till now. Lots of things have changed. So I hope that you enjoyed this part of Dale's book. I hope, as always, you'll drop back by next Friday, because we got to see what happens next. And please tell me what was your favorite thing. If it's the spooky stories or those wonderful, wonderful foodways that Dale shared about his mother.